Hello, my name is Sif, and I am the LGBTQIA plus manager for the Pagan Federation. I am also the co-host of the Heathen Weird podcast. I am one of the copy editors for Pagan Dawn. I'm a digital artist, I have my stall out there, and I'm a Norse heathen. My particular area of interest lies in death and burial in pre-Christian Germanic cultures, alongside the ever-mysterious magical practice of Sather. Now, I have tried to condense this talk down to a tidy 45 minutes or so, but we'll see how we do. I know that a longer version, rewrite that, it's a shorter version of this speech will actually be available in the next issue of Pagan Dawn, which I'm pretty sure it's called Valkyries Servant Masters, I guess the same title as this. I'm known to talk at length about the Valkyries. So here we go, 45 minutes. And Freya, and Hel, burial rites, death, Sather, resurrection, fate threads, you name it, that's my wheelhouse. So why am I so focused on the Valkyries? Well, I think part of this talk will hopefully answer that question today. Full disclosure, I also worship the Valkyries, alongside Hel, Freya, Sif, Scars the Air, who make up the crux of my practice. More than anything, I feel that the Valkyries are so often overlooked. At some point, many heathens and heathen academics agreed that we understood the Maidens of Slaughter to a T, and we filed them away in a folder called something like Done and Dusted. And I absolutely understand the drive to do that. After all, there is a joke in online heathen discourse of A, you're doing it wrong, and B, you can't tell me what to do. We love to talk about theories and discuss, tear things apart, research, analyse everything to the smallest of details. And we had, or so we thought, filed the Valkyries away, we thought we got the entire picture done and thought, yes, this is done. So what have we decided then as a collective? We put them aside and said that they are the essentially Nordic and West Germanic psychopomps. They ferry the spirits of the dead from the mortal world to the land of the gods. But essentially, I believe there is more to learn, more to discover with connections that span across the entirety of the known lore. I'm giving this talk about a week after I did an online bloat for the Valkyries with national and international attendees, which was an incredible moment for me, and I think opened some eyes. For some, that was their first ritual. They had no idea what to expect. Some of them had never even considered reaching out to the Valkyries. Other more seasoned pagans told me that it changed their perspective, and I'm hoping to potentially change your perspective here today. So, imagine a Valkyrie. What do you see? I imagine some people, well, most of you, hopefully have some sort of image in your head of what you imagine Valkyrie to look like. Do you imagine some sort of angel of death wielding a spear? Do you imagine the Wagner-esque bronze breastplate with swirly bits and horned helmets and quite grandiose in their presentation? Well, essentially we have multiple images of the Valkyrie. Dignified cupbearers in Valhalla, women in shining armour on horseback, bloodthirsty, battle-lusted monsters who gleefully twist and pull men's intestines on the battlefield of war. The Valkyries, or Valkyria, to use the Old Norse, are all of these descriptions seemingly at once, and appearing here and there in the myths and sagas as agents of Odin. Their roster, for lack of a better word, changes frequently. Neil Price quotes 52 named Valkyries in the Viking Way. Other academics say between 48 and 52, depending on whether they see some figures as reincarnating into the next generation of Valkyries, or indeed whether they see certain Valkyries as just another name for Freya, which is quite a common perspective. And I'll touch on that again later. But regardless, mystery and intrigue surrounds them. And yet the haunting image of the winged warrior woman persists even today in the collective zeitgeist. But who were they? What knowledge have we potentially lost over the last 1,000 years? Ultimately, we can only guess, as infuriating as that is, and what is an ongoing effort for many heathens to piece together the scattered pieces. So with that in mind, I will come to the crux of the talk. I am personally disheartened by the all too common narrative that the Valkyries are and were mere servants, almost mindless drones of Odin who carry out his will. There are numerous academics and heathens alike that almost fall into this trap of this perspective, making Odin into sort of an omni-god, meting out his will and whim through his hordes of winged warriors on the battlefield. They are often described by modern writers as beings without personality or agency of any kind, and it's by no means an accurate statement. Don't worry, we're only 2 pages in. Sorry. Quick recap. We were talking about the common modern perception of Valkyries and the perspective of Odin being an omni-god. Right, got to that point. H.R. Ellis Davidson, one of my favourite writers and academics, calls them battle goddesses in her work Myths and Symbols in Pagan Europe, worthy of reverence in their own right. And that's pretty much where I stand. But let's break this all down to past me 4 or 5 years ago, back to one persistent nagging question, the first of many. It's a question that settled firmly in the back of my mind and refused to leave. It's a question that seemed completely at odds with this image of the Valkyries I've described, an image almost entirely summarised by the idea of them being Odin's servants. The question is this: if the Valkyries are Odin's servants, why does Freya get half of the chosen dead? This is stated in Grimnir's Well, verse 14, and was one of the sayings of Grimnir in the Poetic Edda. To use the Bellows translation, the 9th is Folkvar, where Freya decrees who shall have seats in the hall. The half of the dead each stage as she choose, and half does Odin have. Snorri Sturluson echoes this in the Prose Edda during the beguiling of Gylfi. But Freya is the most renowned of the goddesses. She has in heaven a dwelling called Volkvanger, and wheresoever she rides to the battle, in each strife, she has one half of the kill and Odin half. Now there are ways of interpreting this, and many have, as Freya getting first pick of the chosen dead. So first pick of the Valkyries chosen, or indeed any percentage of the chosen dead, sort of flies in the face of the prevalent image of these Valkyries being servants of Odin. Now it's also worth pointing out that the goddesses in the Eddas play a very sort of in-the-back sort of role. There's a bias here that comes from the time they were written, and it would be easy to imagine that details were omitted on top of the natural filtration and dilution due to time, the nature of the oral tradition, and memory. If you do happen to listen to the Heathen Weirdos podcast, then you know we give Snorri a lot of strife, salt, opposition, damn you Snorri. Most of it, say 90%, is tongue-in-cheek. And I give credit where credit is due him, because I'm glad that he wrote these stories down. And I'm glad he included this particular line in his work, because the fact that he included it all gives insight into the potentially greater image. What else could there have been in terms of common knowledge in regards to Frey's connection to the Valkyries and the dead? So we do have here an established connection to Freya and death/battle, but we also have an intriguing breadcrumb to pursue. Because despite their relative absence, it is interesting to note that the Nordic goddesses are often tied very closely to death, or the veil between life and death. Freya, Air, Ran, Hel, Gorveig, and the Valkyries all play a role in this consideration. And in reference to the aforementioned, with a relative scarcity of goddesses in the lore, this association is brought into greater focus. In Valkyrie, Women of the Viking World by Joanne Friedrichsdotter, states that the Disir, female spirits of minor goddesses, appear to give and withhold life, protection, prosperity. They are the guardians and takers of life. This certainly brings to mind the Valkyries themselves, who are often described here and there as Disir, even if modern academia has worked to further demarcate the Disir from the Valkyries over the last couple of decades. Specifically, I believe Karen Beck-Peterson in Norns in Old Norse mythology definitely worked to change the image of the Disir. So, time and time again, we see a connection to goddesses and the control, or at least very heavy influence over life and death. So where do the Valkyries sit in all of this? What is Freya's connection to the Valkyries? Well, one commonly stated theory, which I have my own opinions on, is that Freya is the queen of the Valkyries, otherwise head honcho. It's a view held by Jackson Crawford among many other academics, and it's thought to generally be seen as like a fact if you look into source books and reference books. It's just repeated without any sort of explanation. Indeed, if you're a video game fan like myself, the recent God of War video game, which was set in the Nordic, inspired by Norse mythology, They actually depicted Freya as the previous queen of the Valkyries, with Sigrun being the current queen of the Valkyries. And to be honest, I did really quite enjoy that as an interpretation. Now, don't get me wrong, I would love if we had something solid here. But in my opinion, hot take, it's a relatively weak connective tissue to call Valkyrie the queen of the Valkyries, and it seems to mostly be derived on she's a goddess, generally higher than the Valkyries, she has some sort of connection to the battle dead, and that's basically it. So, interestingly, I've also seen quite a few Freya devotees kick back at the idea of Freya being the queen of the Valkyries. Patricia LaFile, noted heathen in this topic, in her book Freya Lady Vanadis, I would also recommend that, essentially writes that describing Freya as a Valkyrie does her a disservice, for, and I quote, "We know that Freya was a very important goddess in her own right. The Valkyries were Odin's servants. They served warriors who entered Valhalla mead and meat all night long. Therefore, it stands to reason that Freya, certainly never mentioned as a servant to any other deity, would not be a Valkyrie, a rank high among the gods of the Norse assures this." And that seems to be the common perspective in having to lower Freya to the Valkyries' level to allow the association to work. I think in many ways this narrative has hindered any sort of reconsideration of the Valkyries and their role in the lore. I posit that we should work instead to elevate the Valkyries from the image of a servant, and this is the foundation of the talk, and become crucial deciders of fate. Before I move on, I feel it would be appropriate to mention there are so many differing opinions when it comes to Freya and the connection to the Valkyries. We have the vile idea that lowering Freya does her a disservice. We also have academics such as Maria Vilhau, who in her book Seeds of Yggdrasil, which is a massive beast at like 600, 800 pages, believes Gondor and Hilda are Freya along with Gulveig, which we'll mention again in a moment. We don't have anything more than conjecture. So here's me adding my hat into the ring, and of course it goes without saying, all due respect to every writer that's come before me. Ultimately, I believe fundamentally that by analysing the relationship between the Valkyries and Freya, we can potentially and apprehensively start to fill in the holes in heathen lore, and namely the machinations behind the Great War between Yasir and Vanir and the deal struck between the two tribes of gods. I know that seems very lofty goals. Dream big. Ultimately, as you might have guessed, I sound very much on the side of, despite these centuries of academic discourse, we haven't touched the surface of the Eddas. There are things that we've accepted as facts or common knowledge that I feel we should reevaluate, Valkyries naturally included. So why were, if you have any knowledge about this, hostages exchanged between the Yasir and Vanir? Why were seemingly the most prominent of Vanir gods selected to live among the Yasir? Why was Freya among them, for only 2 Yasir gods were sent to the Vanir, in here, Hymir and Mimir? In my belief, the answer to that lies in the Vanir's mastery of Seithr. Everything links together. But one potential use of Seithr that particularly piques my interest, at least historically, what we see in the Eddas, is its potential use as a tool for resurrection. It is here that things become staggeringly interesting, the connective threads coming alive with possibility. We know, as far as the core sources inform us, that the Vanir had Seithr workers among their ranks, with Freya being the most prominent among them, probably the most powerful among them. If Seithr does involve some sort of resurrection element, it would be easy to see how a stalemate would occur between the two sides, if indeed the gods can die any way mortals can. The Aesir would find themselves against an undying Vanir army, and pretty unstoppable to beat. I wanted to find an academic that kind of grounded this idea that I was pursuing, and in fact Ursula Dronke did exactly that in her works around the Great War. Now, endless battle against resurrected forces may seem quite a familiar premise, just ticking in the back of your head there, and potentially here we see a seed planted of Valhalla, what would eventually become Valhalla. Once again, I found myself beaten to the punch by this idea, as another academic, Richard North, in 1997, did this exact similar comparison. I was born far too late, apparently. Perhaps Odin, the thought of Ragnarok or another calamitous event at the front of his mind, from the Sirius's prophecy in the Vluspa, saw potential in this resurrection magic. He remembered Gulveig, she who died and was given life again 3 times. He saw it as a potential tool, potentially. This might explain Odin's actions that followed the Great War. A truce and an exchange of hostages followed to reinforce the renewed peace. A truce and Odin seeking Frey's safe work, impressive even among the incredible talents of the Vanir. What is interesting is that the ambiguity of the excerpts of Poetic Edda and Heimskringla that mention the hostage exchange lend ambiguity to the whole affair. As I've touched on, 3 Vanir gods end up in Asgard in exchange for Surazia. It wouldn't be a jump to say that Freya was simply invited to join her brother and father, and looking at the alternative of a home without them, accepted the arrangement. This sets her arrival in Asgard as one altogether more favourable, rather than that of a hostage or a tool for peacemaking. Again, there's very much the feeling that the literature jumbles all of this up and the explanations have been washed away from time. The lines connecting Gorvig, Freya, and the nature of the exchange, Odin and Seithr, are made practically incoherent. But connections there are tentative, now they are maybe over 1,000 years later. Nonetheless, courtesy of Snorri and the Heimskringla, we have evidence that Odin and the others here learned Seithr through Freya. I think it's an Englinger. I think I would be remiss here to ignore the similarities between Freya and Odin, as gods associated strongly with lust, battle, and magic. Both can be associated with some sort of frenzy, with ecstatic states. Like Odin, Freya travels and wanders and has many names. I think it's no coincidence that then these 2 gods are tied closely to the Valkyries. But I believe it is Seithr that offers a plausible explanation of the connection between Freya, Odin, and the Valkyries. For a bargain was apparently struck between the 2 gods, a bargain that would eventually lead to the former receiving half of the Valkyries' yield. Perhaps Odin offers Freya half of the chosen dead for a hall in Sessrunir, in exchange for teaching him Seithr. That coveted tool he saw the Vanir utilise in numerous ways during the war. He is a seeker of knowledge after all, so how fantastic a prize would Seithr seem to him? Moreover, and I guess more to the point, Odin wants an undying army to fight against the perceived chaos that might be happening in the future, or a threat equal to the destructive power of Ragnarok. He wants the very best and most capable of Midgard's warriors at his side when the time comes to fight for Asgard's very survival. Perhaps Freya then teaches those that become the Valkyries, Seithr in turn, thereby connecting her to them. This not only establishes a connection between Freya and the Valkyries, but also explains why the Valkyries are apparently all women, Seithr being seen as a particularly feminine magical tool. While I don't hold much weight in Freya being given the title of the Queen of the Valkyries, I do see her as the archetype on which the Valkyries were created, the mould in which they were forged. But why do I believe Seithr to be crucial in the Valkyries' creation? Well, I'm very much of the opinion that historical Seithr is a tool for the manipulation of fate. The topic of fate in Nordic literature is certainly a difficult one to get your head around, and indeed there's often a temptation to lean on, say, the Hellenic interpretation of a fate thread, which is altogether more tidy, for lack of a better term. So for anyone interested in a quick breakdown of that, I urge you, shameless plug, to watch the video on the Heathen Weirdos YouTube channel entitled Multi-Part Soul. Hopefully some of you may have a little, some multi-part soul knowledge right there. Essentially, we can gather that fate and the Norse beliefs around the soul are intricately entwined through a combination of earther or weird, to use the Anglo-Saxon version, and the concept of all are manifesting most strongly through the Hamingar, so the ancestral sort of luck aspect. Further, there's also evidence for a very strong connection between the multi-part soul and Seithr as a practice, namely in a sort of micromanaging the individual elements to converse with the dead, the hugger or mind of those that passed, or otherwise travel to places the hammer, the skin, the physical form cannot go. So like the afterlife, whatever that may be. Before I get lost in the mud, just pocket that idea of the soul and Seithr in my belief as they go hand in hand. In the lore that we do have, Seithr frequently appears to involve protection, divination, resurrection, and by extension, manipulation of the ever-shifting weird. After all, if Odin wants only the chosen slain to be a part of his army in Valhalla, the best warriors, then manipulation of the battlefield seems a given. Your best warriors aren't the most likely to die in battle. Odin himself is no stranger to altering fate, to pull on threads here and there to manipulate events in his favour. We see this with Sigurd, who has his powerful sword Gram, broken by Odin during his battle with King Yngvi. The best warriors, as I've mentioned, are the least likely to die in battle, and that can't be the case if Odin wants his undying army. More to the point, if Seithr does involve the manipulation of weird and that it alters potential and possibility, then we get another aspect of the battle maidens, the Valkyries, in their roles as choosers of the slain, as healers, protectors, and guardians. I will preface this by saying that dual roles are not uncommon in the lore. We see the Valkyries themselves, bloodthirsty though they are on the battlefield, become cupbearers in Odin's hall. Freya, she of love, beauty, passion, powerful safe worker, is also strongly associated with war and death. Let's say heir, handmaiden to Frigg, protector and healer, could be one and the same as the Valkyrie known as heir. And in this, I see that the Valkyrie heir is a healer and field battle medic, carrying out that duty on the battlefield. This fits. If the Valkyries were to intervene in fate, then healing someone to avoid needless death completes the image. They deliver death and spare life equally in their realm, the blood-spattered field of battle. The clatter of swords is their chorus, the roar of desperate men their choir. Forgive me for getting a touch lyrical for a moment. I can't help it. This manipulation allows them to alter the battle to ensure those chosen actually perish, making shields fall, guiding an arrow to its mark. We see sources evoke the imagery of Seithr on numerous occasions, but most notably in Jarl Saga, which has that glorious long dedication to the Valkyries of men's entrails with the warp and weft, and Roland Darkfeather, where the Valkyries spin flax. Gondal, who makes an appearance in the Heimskringla, Jarl Saga, and Luspa, among others, is a figure of particular interest here, and a being who interests me personally. A name is often translated as wand wielder or staff bearer, derived from Gander, a staff that is strongly associated with Seithr. Rudolf Simic also posits that the Valkyrie Sveepul's name refers to the changeable nature of fate. If the Valkyries are the masters of the battlefield, choosing who lives and who dies, does this not grant them extraordinary power in the time of the Vikings, and indeed throughout time? After all, few events can make and break empires more than the crucible of battle. Kings die, kingdoms fall, thousands of families are impacted. Fates are changed dramatically and drastically across vast regions. War shapes those regions, and the Valkyries, through their power alone, give victory or death. This idea is reinforced back in the beguiling of Gylfi, and that here, Odin in disguise states that while he sends these Valkyries off to every battle, it is the Valkyries themselves that determine who is victor. Or we do have one example of a Valkyrie, in this case Brunhild, being punished for not following Odin's decree to give victories to a particular army. That is indeed only one example among many examples of no such punishment being given, or indeed any other examples of Odin having any sort of direct input in who is declared victor. I feel I must also touch on the fact that Snorri also does specify here that Skuld, youngest Norn, as he calls her, is listed among the Valkyries, which is stated in the Poetic Edda. This is fascinating to me, because it adds a little weight to the idea that the Valkyries' decisions play a crucial role in deciding what may come to pass of a possible future. Perhaps checks and balances need to be considered, or Skuld in some way needs to be consulted on how deciding one way or another may impact what may happen. It's a pretty common practice to associate the Norns with their Hellenic counterparts, the Fates, and associate them to mean respectively past, present, and future. This isn't an accurate sort of representation, but as I've touched on, fate in the Nordic world is changeable and ever shifting. The fact that the Valkyries have a decision at all in who is victor on the battlefield acts as testament to that. From a very human perspective, the Valkyries play a crucial intermediary role between the shining heights of Asgard and the mortal realm of Midgard. Saxo Grammaticus, in the third book of his history, describes the Valkyries as a sort of guide, visiting the hero of the story throughout his life. Here they alter the fortune of war and give blessings. This is a role similar to that fulfilled by the goddess Athena and her favourite Odysseus. Perhaps the Valkyries themselves at one point or another were seen as more champions of heroes. And on a sort of final point, we've got time. The Valkyries are not a monolith. This is important, I think, in helping to tear down the idea of the Valkyries as one unit without personality, which in turn reinforces the notion of them being almost a footnote in the sagas and headers. We very rarely get a statement such as, the Valkyries are coming, the Valkyries arrive, Valkyries choose among the dead. Rather, they are almost always individually named in every single instance, like the gods themselves. Perhaps most intriguing of all are the names of these corpse maidens, Valkyries. They have many titles, I might drop in there. At first glance, it is easy to conclude that they embody the chaotic noise and horror of battle. The clashing of shields, spears meeting flesh, arrows raining down from above, but there are evident outliers, as we've mentioned. Air, as I've said, I believe is also a Valkyrie, means heal, help, mercy, depending on the interpretation. There's also Rathgritter, meaning possibly counsel truce, or truce. There's Nipt, which means sister, and Olrune, which means ale rune, probably referring to their role as serving mead in Valhalla. These names, while admittedly fewer in number than those associated with war and battle, fascinate me. And I go once more to the point that the Valkyries are not a monolith, and I believe some may have had duties outside of that of ferrying souls of the chosen dead. This may offer some justification to the duality of the Valkyrie outside of the quiet domestication during the heroic sagas, at once serving mead in Valhalla and, to use my favourite description of Hilda, desiring Ron of the excessive drying of veins. Of a parent maiden and monster, they're incredibly metal, I love them. With all of this in mind, I believe that being a Valkyrie was a role one undertook, rather than some sort of permanent classification or race. Perhaps a goddess or being, maybe even a human, to account for those mortals apparently chosen in the later sagas, who were particularly skilled at Seither and fate weaving, otherwise had a bloodlust that made them suited to wading into mortal battlefields, were trained to become Valkyries. While choosing the slain was their core mission, it may be far from their only mission, and they had a role to play in guiding heroes who were particularly weighed down, for lack of a better term of phrase, glorious purpose, those that would change many a fate in battle. While it may be true that they were guided and worked alongside Odin, I believe that they were an essential tool for the manipulation of fate and in forging a potential favourable future on a grand scale. In this, they are perhaps better explained, in my opinion, to be a sort of agent of the Nornia, sitting comfortably in that sort of arena. Just as a piece of brain food, but something I haven't had time to touch on in much detail. Both the Valkyries and the Nornia have a connection to swans. It's a fascinating potential for a rabbit hole or two, and I do recommend if you're interested in diving into that rabbit hole. And also the connecting the prevalent idea of animals being realm travellers, or animal forms being adopted for travelling across the worlds. So, I will say for now I've talked long enough. I am writing a book on this, shameless book. So all in all, I strongly believe that the Valkyries lived up to their name as choosers of the slain, and were masters of fate on the battlefield, pulling threads and actively changing the course of battle. They chose who lived and who died on a landscape of vast rippling consequences. So, were the Valkyries mere servants of Odin? I think maybe not. Hopefully I've given you something to think about. Anyone have any questions?
I'll give you a question. So obviously all of our written sources about the Valkyries talk about them in terms of a sort of early medieval battlefield, because that's, when the written sources come from. What's your belief in terms of, are they still doing it now?
Yes. I think maybe they've changed or adapted. It really depends on how you see the modern field of battle, which is quite impersonal at times, about whether they have adapted their chosen dead. I believe if we were to take some of the elements that I've talked about as choosers of the slain, maybe if there's another way that can manifest in the modern world, then they're absolutely still doing stuff in the modern day. Anywhere that massive moments of fate change, that can ripple across countries or nations of the world, they're present, 100% in my belief. Anything else? Hello.
One of the most common descriptions I've heard of Valkyries is as shield maidens.
Mm-hmm.
So with you reevaluating the Valkyries' role, does that go hand in hand with reevaluating what a shield maiden was in Viking culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the narrative at the moment around bringing in shield maidens is fascinating, because I think that for a while it's kind of just dismissed as, oh, no, I don't think any women are on those roads or whatever. And we're seeing this massive shift in at least what I've seen in the academic discourse and in pagan spaces of being like, well, this has been seen as the fact for so long, but what is it true? Let's reevaluate, look at the evidence. And there's really some really good work at the moment being done into that. That goes hand in hand with the Valkyries and indeed all of the goddesses' roles and roles in the stories and between the gods and the relations. So I think that answered your question. So yes, it's I mean the Shield Maiden stuff is honestly fascinating, and like Leszek Gardella is an academic that works really, really well in that sphere, and he's doing fantastic stuff and reevaluating and changing the paradigm of what we think about women in the Viking world. It's definitely something I've seen pop up quite frequently these days. Hello.
I'm still getting to know all of this really, but there's a big one that kind of occurs to me. I don't know where childbirth fits in with any Viking god or goddesses or who's involved in that, but it occurs to me that there must be some connection between women, since traditionally that's what we do, and rebirth, but also fate, choosing who lives and dies, etc.
Yeah,
so I
that's
wonder where that might come into it.
absolutely. There is a lot of the goddesses seem to be in between that veil of life and death, of air healing, saving potential death, someone from potentially dying. Freya's very much death and love and passion, fertility and all of that. I mean, there's a reoccurring theme over and over again of the goddesses being very much on that line of death and life. And that's across quite a few cultures, but I think it's very prominent in like a Nordic heathen sort of lore. Any others? I'm here for the next 10 minutes. We'll just keep talking about the Valkyries, it's fun.
All of that stuff you've got written there, is that the stuff that you're putting in your book? Is that?
Yes. My book, actually, this was originally a chapter in the book.
Okay.
A lot of it is in, the tentative title is Working the Threads, like reevaluating historical data. And it's a lot about bringing in, obviously we have basically nothing but historical data, so my curiosity was like, oh, this looks a lot like bringing in the multi-part soul stuff, with like the manipulation of certain parts of the soul, the hammer, the hugger, the fylgja, the hamminga, all working together and interacting. And the idea of the Orlogssima, which is mentioned in Regismal 14, is a fate thread, and that's probably the most intriguing kind of like word choice. And honestly, it's like I'm just going to nerd out about this. So this was originally a chapter, and where I was just like, okay, so what is the connection between Freya, who's obviously very much into the Satan sort of side of things, and the Valkyries, because that's just a connection that no one's fully explained, and it's just and really irritatingly, Danny Snoring, he just drops it and leaves. It's just like there's a connection, bye. But yeah, there's definitely something we haven't touched into in terms of the academic side of things, and indeed as heathens, that I really want to dig into and find out more about.
Just the way you were talking and analysing, other sources and stuff, I just thought it'd make a fantastic PhD topic. If you did fancy PhD.
I'm up for it. I will take any challenge. Fantastic. Anything else? It's been fantastic to talk about this. So thank you for coming to my talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you.